The hospital is a place where people come to be healed, yet hidden beneath its sterile walls and fluorescent lights, there are stories that cling like shadows, haunting every hallway, whispering in the empty corridors at night. This is the story of a night nurse named Clara, who worked in the intensive care unit of St. Augustine's General Hospital. Clara was used to her night shifts being quiet, too quiet sometimes, where only the hum of machines and the occasional muffled cry from a patient disturbed the silence. But over time, Clara began to notice things that were off. It started one evening as she was making her rounds, checking vitals on patients, lost in her thoughts. She walked past room 18 and thought she saw someone standing at the foot of the bed. When she glanced back, the room was empty. She shook it off as a trick of the light or her tired mind playing games, but her footsteps slowed when she noticed the heart monitor. The patient in room 18 had flatlined. She knew she had checked his vitals not even half an hour before. He'd been stable, expected to make a recovery. Confused, she called in a code blue and the team rushed in, desperately working to revive him, but it was too late. The incident lingered in her mind, but she told herself it was a coincidence. People passed away in the hospital all the time, often without warning. But a week later, Clara was back on shift, and again she felt that strange presence near room 18. The atmosphere in the hallway seemed heavier, charged with a kind of cold electricity. Clara checked her watch, realizing it was exactly the same time of night the last patient had passed away in that room. A chill swept over her, leaving her fingers and toes numb, and she saw that the new patient in room 18, someone who had been in the ICU for a routine operation, was lying perfectly still. Clara rushed in, her heart pounding, and reached for the patient's wrist to check for a pulse. Nothing. A flatline. He was gone. The doctors were baffled. This patient had been in no immediate danger. They marked it down as a heart attack, a natural death. But Clara knew something was wrong. It didn't feel natural. She was now certain she hadn't imagined seeing the shadow by his bed that first night. Room 18 was different. She couldn't explain it, but she felt watched every time she walked past it. She tried to avoid the room on her rounds, even going out of her way to get the nurse's aide to do her check-ins. 3 nights later, Clara's close friend Marissa, also a night nurse, came to her with a shaky, horrified look in her eyes. "I saw him too," Marissa whispered. She explained that while she'd been walking by room 18, she'd glanced inside and had seen the figure of a man standing by the window, staring out with his back to her. But as she looked closer, he turned his head slowly, almost deliberately, and she realized he had no eyes, just empty, black sockets. The next day, Marissa took a leave of absence, citing health issues, and Clara never saw her return. After that, Clara began to hear stories from other staff. Some claimed that room 18 had been the site of a tragic incident decades ago, a patient who died in pain after the staff failed to save him in time. Since then, several patients had passed away mysteriously in that room, and those who worked the night shifts talked about glimpsing a shadowy figure, a man with hollow eyes, always around the same hour. Some of the staff dismissed it as a ghost story meant to spook the new hires, but Clara knew better. She'd felt that cold, creeping dread. She'd felt his presence. The hospital administration denied all rumors. They couldn't have that kind of reputation attached to St. Augustine's. It would drive people away, invite scrutiny. They kept room 18 open, moving patients in and out as if nothing was wrong, despite the whispered warnings and pleas from the night staff. But the deaths continued, always unexpected, always seemingly without reason. One night, Clara's dread came to a breaking point. She was halfway through her shift when the head nurse assigned her a new patient, room 18. She begged to be given a different assignment, tried to explain, but they brushed her off, citing the usual protocol. This was her job, after all. Reluctantly, with a stomach knotted in fear, she made her way to the room. She stood in the doorway, staring into the dim room, unable to make herself move further inside. The air was thick with something dark and rotten, something that clawed its way into her lungs. She forced herself to step closer, barely able to lift her feet, and glanced at the patient. He was an elderly man, lying silent and motionless, and though he was hooked up to every monitor, she noticed a slight flicker in his heart rate. It was slowing down, dipping lower with each passing second. Then she saw it. the shadow in the corner of the room. It was the figure of a man, but no features were visible. Clara's heart raced as she watched him drift closer, moving toward the bed, his empty eyes fixated on the patient. Her instinct was to run, but she forced herself to stay, watching in horror as the figure leaned over the man's bed, placing a hand on his chest. The heart monitor let out a single, flat beep. The patient was gone. Clara couldn't take it anymore. She stumbled backward out of the room, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as she nearly fell to the floor. She tried to explain what she'd seen to her superiors, but no one believed her. They attributed it to stress, to burnout, urging her to take some time off. But Clara knew the truth. She wasn't crazy, and she wasn't alone. Night after night, she heard other nurses talking, whispering about how they'd seen him too, how they'd felt his presence, how room 18 seemed to claim lives without warning, always in the dead of night. Finally, Clara couldn't bear it any longer. She quit her job and left the hospital for good, but she could never shake the feeling that something had followed her. That shadow, that cold touch, that empty stare. She would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, her skin icy, feeling that same presence as if he was standing by her bed, watching her, waiting. St. Augustine's continues to operate to this day, and room 18 is still in use. New patients come and go, and sometimes they leave alive, but not always. The hospital keeps their deaths recorded as natural causes, unexplained heart attacks, but the night staff know better. And even if they try to ignore it, they'll sometimes catch a glimpse in the corner of their eye, a shadow, a figure, waiting patiently in room 18 for the next soul to claim. Late at night, there are places in hospitals where even seasoned doctors and nurses dread to tread. The ICU, the psychiatric ward, and certain cold, sterile hallways carry the weight of suffering, trauma, and sometimes something far worse. This story revolves around one such place, a morgue in the basement of St. Gabriel's Hospital, a place steeped in mystery and shunned by those who work the night shift. Mia, a new morgue technician, had been warned by her co-workers not to work late shifts alone, especially after midnight. She dismissed their warnings as mere superstition, stories invented to scare the new employees. She was no stranger to death. She had seen countless bodies, prepped dozens for autopsies, and had grown numb to the silence of the dead. But that was before she began to notice things. On her very first solo shift, Mia heard faint sounds as she organized files in the morgue's back office. It was barely a whisper, a distant murmur that sounded like voices. She ignored it at first, telling herself it was probably the echo of nurses talking down the hall or the rattling of the hospital's old pipes. But the murmurs grew louder, shifting from indistinct chatter to clear, coherent whispers, whispers that seemed to call her name. Against her better judgment, Mia stepped out into the main room. The morgue was icy cold, the kind of cold that felt alive, wrapping around her limbs and filling her lungs with each breath. There was no one else there, just rows of covered bodies, silent, unmoving. She told herself it was only her imagination, but her hands trembled as she returned to her paperwork, hearing her name drift from the shadows every few minutes. Then, just after midnight, the power went out. The only light came from a small red emergency bulb near the door. The room was plunged into a murky, shadow-filled darkness that seemed to swallow up everything. Mia held her breath, hoping the power would flicker back on, but minutes passed, and the morgue remained silent and dark. She fumbled for her phone, activating the flashlight, and pointed it toward the cold storage units, the wall of metal drawers where bodies were kept. She'd counted them before the lights went out. There had been 12 bodies in storage that night. But as her flashlight scanned the units, she noticed something chilling. One of the drawers was open. Mia's heart raced. She hadn't opened it, and no one else was supposed to be down here. She cautiously stepped closer, shining her light into the empty drawer. There was no body, only an imprint on the metal where one had once laid. Feeling a knot of dread in her stomach, she turned to search the room, her mind racing through the only logical explanations. Perhaps an orderly had mistakenly removed a body and forgotten to close the drawer. But then she heard a dragging sound. It was slow, methodical, coming from somewhere in the shadows. She swung her flashlight in the direction of the sound, her hands shaking uncontrollably, until the light fell upon a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was a man, tall and gaunt, wearing a hospital gown. His face was pale, his eyes wide and staring, yet devoid of any life. She recognized him. He'd been brought in the day before after a fatal car accident. She knew without a doubt that he was supposed to be dead. She froze, watching in horror as he shuffled forward, his movements stiff and unnatural. His face was blank, as though he were sleepwalking, yet his eyes remained locked on hers. She stumbled back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body wouldn't listen. As he approached, his mouth fell open, and he began to speak in a hollow, rasping voice. "They wouldn't let me in," he whispered. "They sent me back." Suddenly, he collapsed onto the floor, and Mia finally regained control of her legs, stumbling backward and crashing into the wall. Her flashlight clattered to the ground, and in the faint glow of the emergency bulb, she saw the man's lifeless body crumpled on the cold floor. She didn't dare move closer, her breath coming in panicked gasps. She tried to convince herself it was some horrific prank, a hallucination, anything other than what she had just seen. But her relief was short-lived. From the shadows near the open drawer, she began to hear more sounds. Footsteps, the shuffle of feet dragging slowly across the tile. More bodies, still dressed in hospital gowns, emerged from the darkness, their vacant eyes fixed on her. She counted 5, 6, then 7 figures, each moving in jerky, unsettling motions, each one supposed to be dead and sealed away. They surrounded her, forming a circle, trapping her. Mia pressed herself against the cold metal wall, too terrified to scream, as one of the bodies, a young girl, no older than 12, stepped forward. Her skin was ashen, her small hands hanging limply at her sides, and her eyes were dark, void of any expression. "It hurts," the girl whispered, her voice so soft it was almost a sigh. "We don't want to be here." One by one, each figure echoed her words, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair. The sound was unbearable, a symphony of suffering that filled her ears and gnawed at her mind. She sank to the floor, covering her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, willing the nightmare to end. But the voices grew louder, each whisper becoming a scream, a plea, a demand to be released from whatever horror held them here. Finally, when she thought she would lose her mind, the emergency lights flickered and the power returned. She opened her eyes, her ears still ringing, to find the room empty. The bodies were back in their drawers, each unit sealed tight as though nothing had ever happened. But the open drawer remained, a dark reminder of what she'd just seen. Mia quit her job the next day, refusing to return to the morgue. She told herself it had been a hallucination, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion, but the memories lingered, haunting her every thought. She heard whispers at night, saw shadows in the corners of her vision, and felt the chill of the morgue every time she closed her eyes. St. Gabriel's still operates its morgue, of course, but the late shifts are rarely staffed anymore. Rumors spread quickly through the hospital, stories of voices, shadows, and bodies that seemed to move on their own. The staff now refuse to enter the morgue after midnight, no matter how urgent the case. They say that those who died in pain, those whose deaths were violent or unnatural, linger in the hospital basement, trapped between worlds, seeking someone to release them, or perhaps to join them. Years ago, St. Vincent's Hospital had an unspoken rule among its staff: never take the elevator to the basement after midnight. The basement housed the old records room, a place rarely visited, stacked with forgotten patient files, dusty x-rays, and equipment long out of use. No one knew exactly why it was avoided, but stories circulated about strange noises, flickering lights, and feelings of unease that settled over anyone brave enough to go down there. Some whispered about a patient who had died in that basement years ago, his spirit restless, bound to the hospital in anger. Lena, a new nurse working the night shift, was unaware of the stories. She'd only been at the hospital for a few weeks, so when she was asked by her supervisor to retrieve an old file from the records room, she took the request without a second thought. It was a little past midnight, and the elevator was the only way down. The doors opened with a mechanical groan, and she stepped inside, pressing the button for the basement. As the doors closed and the elevator began its slow descent, the air grew colder. Lena could see her reflection in the brushed steel of the elevator doors and noticed something odd. Her reflection didn't match her posture. It seemed to be standing a bit taller, its head slightly tilted, almost as though it was looking past her shoulder at something. She quickly turned around, but there was no one else in the elevator. She let out a nervous laugh, blaming her exhaustion, and looked back at her reflection, which now appeared normal. The elevator lurched to a stop in the basement, and the doors slid open. She stepped out, feeling an unnatural chill in the air, colder than anywhere else in the hospital. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows that made the hallway seem to stretch and twist. Lena tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling as she made her way to the records room, her footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. The records room door was heavy and creaked loudly as she pushed it open, the sound ringing out like a cry in the silence. She found herself in a dimly lit room, its walls lined with shelves of thick, dusty folders and old boxes. The smell of mildew and decay filled the air, and Lena wrinkled her nose as she searched for the file her supervisor had asked for. Her eyes scanned the shelves, her fingers grazing over the thick layers of dust as she pulled out old files, one by one. Suddenly, she heard a faint, wheezing breath just behind her. Startled, she turned around, but no one was there. She dismissed it as her imagination and tried to focus, but a few seconds later, the sound returned. This time louder, raspier, as if someone were struggling to breathe right beside her. Her heart pounded as she spun around again, her eyes searching the shadows, but she was alone. The breathing grew louder, and then a low voice, barely above a whisper, echoed in her ears. "Why did you leave me?" The voice was hoarse, filled with pain and anger. Lena froze, gripping the edge of a shelf as her knees went weak. She tried to convince herself that it was just her mind playing tricks, that maybe the sounds were coming from the air vents, but she could feel the presence in the room, lingering just out of sight, watching her. She quickly grabbed the file she needed and turned to leave, her footsteps quickening as she moved toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. She twisted it harder, but it remained locked. Panic set in as she pounded on the door, calling for help, but the walls seemed to swallow her cries. The lights began to flicker violently, casting strange shadows across the room. She could see movement in the corner of her eye, small, shuffling footsteps as though someone were pacing around her. Turning slowly, Lena's eyes widened as she saw him, a man with ashen skin, gaunt cheeks, and hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through her. He wore a tattered hospital gown, and his hands were clenched into tight fists. The man's expression was filled with fury, his mouth opening to speak, but no sound came out. Only that dreadful, wheezing breath filled the air. Lena pressed herself against the door, frantically jiggling the handle, willing it to open. But the ghostly figure took a step toward her, his gaze filled with unrelenting hatred. He raised one bony finger and pointed directly at her, his hollow eyes narrowing as his mouth twisted into a snarl. "You left me," he rasped, his voice like nails scraping over metal. "You let me die alone." Memories began to flood Lena's mind, memories that weren't hers. She saw a hospital bed, a weak and desperate patient pressing a call button, his breath shallow and labored. She felt his fear, his despair, his agony as he waited for someone to help him, but no one came. She watched, horrified, as the man took his last breath alone, his eyes wide with terror and betrayal, the pain, the loneliness, the anger. She felt it all, as if it were her own. The vision faded, and Lena found herself back in the records room, her body trembling, drenched in a cold sweat. The ghostly figure was still there, watching her, his form flickering in and out with the stuttering lights. She tried to speak, to apologize, though she didn't know why. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The figure paused, his empty gaze softening, but only for a moment. Then his face twisted again, his mouth stretching into an unnatural grimace. "It's too late." His voice echoed through the room, filled with an unbearable bitterness, a final, chilling accusation. At that moment, the door handle suddenly gave way, and Lena stumbled backward, falling into the hallway. She scrambled to her feet and ran, never looking back, her footsteps pounding down the hall as the sound of that tortured, wheezing breath followed her, fading only when she reached the elevator. She didn't breathe until the doors closed, sealing her safely inside. She punched the button for the main floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she watched the basement disappear from view. When she returned to the nurse's station, her face pale and her hands still trembling, her supervisor looked at her with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. Lena tried to explain, to tell him about the man in the basement, but he simply shook his head. "That's why no one goes down there alone," he said quietly, as if it were common knowledge. The other nurses told her the story then. The story of a patient who'd been left to die in the basement, his call for help unheard. Since then, his spirit lingered, bound by anger and sorrow, appearing only to those who ventured there alone, his only wish to confront the living for the care he was denied in death. Lena never returned to the basement. She transferred to a different hospital soon after, hoping to leave the memory of that night behind. But every now and then, when she's alone in a quiet room, she hears a faint, rasping breath and feels a chill settle over her. She knows he's still out there, waiting for someone to answer his call, even if it means dragging them into the darkness with him. The hospital was empty in a way only the dead of night could bring. Dr. Ellis, a seasoned emergency physician, was used to long, quiet hours with only the occasional whisper of a nurse or the steady hum of equipment to keep him company. But there was one room in the hospital he tried to avoid, room 66. Tucked away in an old, rarely used wing, room 66 was often left unoccupied, as if even the hospital administration was aware of its unnerving reputation. Staff spoke about it in hushed tones, trading stories of cold spots and strange sounds, and how patients admitted to that room would often decline rapidly, sometimes even passing away without warning. Dr. Ellis hadn't thought much of it until the night an elderly man was wheeled into the ER, his condition critical. They'd been out of rooms, and in the chaos of trying to save his life, no one noticed which room he was taken to, room 66. By the time Dr. Ellis made it to the man's bedside, it was already past midnight. The patient, Mr. Green, was asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. Dr. Ellis stood by the bed, double-checking the charts, relieved that Mr. Green had stabilized. As he looked down at the patient, he noticed a strange bruise on the man's forearm, an odd, hand-shaped mark that hadn't been there when Mr. Green arrived. He brushed it off as a strange coincidence, making a note to investigate later. But something about it made him uneasy, as though the bruise were a warning. An hour passed, and as Dr. Ellis sat alone in his office, he began to feel an oppressive heaviness, a sensation of being watched. The feeling was so intense he decided to check on Mr. Green. But when he entered room 66, his stomach twisted. The elderly man was sitting up, his eyes wide open, staring at the far corner of the room. His gaze was vacant, his expression a twisted mix of fear and pain. Dr. Ellis approached cautiously, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "Mr. Green, are you all right?" The man didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the corner, as if he were watching something unseen, something terrifying. Slowly, his lips began to move, forming words barely above a whisper. She's here. She won't leave." He repeated it, his voice shaking, the hand-shaped bruise on his arm darkening as if freshly pressed by invisible fingers. Dr. Ellis felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "Who's here, Mr. Green?" he asked, but the man didn't answer. He only continued to stare into the empty corner, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. And then, without warning, Mr. Green let out a sharp gasp, his body going rigid. Alarms on the heart monitor blared as his heart rate spiked and then flatlined. Dr. Ellis sprang into action, calling a code and beginning chest compressions. Nurses rushed in, and for nearly 20 minutes they worked to revive Mr. Green, but it was no use. His heart refused to start again, and finally they had to call the time of death. Disturbed and exhausted, Dr. Ellis left the room, trying to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something that froze him in place. In the corner where Mr. Green had been staring, a figure stood, shrouded in shadow, barely visible in the dim light. It was the silhouette of a woman, her face pale and her eyes dark pits that seemed to absorb the light around her. She watched him, unmoving, her gaze filled with a hollow rage. Dr. Ellis blinked, and the figure vanished. He told himself it was a trick of the mind, exhaustion playing with his senses. But the chill lingered, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he just encountered something far beyond his understanding. Over the following weeks, more patients were admitted to room 66, each one entering the room with mild or moderate symptoms, only to deteriorate rapidly without explanation. Those who survived spoke of seeing a woman standing in the corner of the room at night, watching them with empty, hollow eyes. Nurses reported hearing whispers, soft and pleading, when the room was empty. And some nights, even the doctors would catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows. One evening, a nurse, Sarah, was cleaning up after a particularly chaotic shift. She had been assigned to room 66 that night, and as she entered to check on supplies, the door creaked closed behind her. She thought nothing of it at first, until the air turned icy cold, making her breath visible in the stale hospital air. She heard a soft weeping, so faint she could barely make it out. It sounded like it was coming from all around her, echoing off the walls. Terrified, she turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. Panicking, she began pounding on it, calling out for help, but no one came. She could still hear the weeping, growing louder, as though whoever was crying was standing just inches away from her. She turned, and there in the dim light was the woman. The same figure countless patients had described. She was standing close enough that Sarah could see her face, pale and twisted in anguish, her hollow eyes weeping blood that ran down her cheeks. The woman leaned forward, her cold breath brushing against Sarah's ear as she whispered, "Why didn't you save me?" The words were filled with a deep, bottomless sorrow, tinged with anger. Sarah closed her eyes, pressing herself against the door, whispering apologies, praying for it to end. Just as suddenly as it began, the presence vanished, the room warming up, the door unlocking on its own. Sarah stumbled out of room 66, her heart racing, and immediately handed in her resignation. She couldn't stay, not after what she'd seen, what she'd felt. The story spread quickly, and eventually the hospital administration made the decision to close off room 66 for good. Rumor had it that years before, a young woman had been left alone there, her call button disconnected by accident. She died alone and in pain, her final hours spent calling for help that never came. Her anger, her sorrow, lingered, bound to the room that had been her last. To this day, room 66 remains sealed, a silent reminder of what happened there. But those who work the night shifts say that sometimes, as they pass the door, they hear faint, desperate whispers, pleas for help, for mercy, for release from the torment that binds her still. And on especially dark nights, if you look closely enough, you might see her shadow lingering just beyond the frosted glass window, watching, waiting for someone to open the door. St. Augustine's was an old hospital, its walls soaked in years of tragedy and suffering. Most of the doctors and nurses had learned to ignore the strange occurrences, the odd sounds in empty hallways, the flickering lights, the occasional cold spot. But there was one story that every staff member, new or old, knew to be true. The story of the lost boy. The story went like this. Years ago, a young boy named Thomas had been admitted to the hospital with a severe respiratory illness. His mother had stayed by his side day and night, but during a particularly hectic shift, the boy was moved from one floor to another to make room for other patients. Somehow, in the confusion, his records got misplaced, and his mother was never notified. For hours, Thomas lay alone in his new room, calling out for his mother, but no one came. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. Thomas had passed away, alone and afraid, his small hands clutching his sheets as if he were holding on for dear life. Now, every few months, staff members would claim they'd seen or heard Thomas in the hospital. Nurses swore they'd hear soft footsteps in the empty pediatric wing late at night. Sometimes they'd even find small handprints on the windows of closed-off rooms, and on occasion, the faint sound of a child crying would drift through the hallways, stopping suddenly when someone approached. One night, during an especially quiet shift, Nurse Lena was assigned to the night rounds. She'd been at St. Augustine's for less than a month and had heard plenty of stories about the lost boy, but she didn't take them seriously. Ghost stories were just ways to break up the monotony, she thought. But that night, she would find out just how real they could be. It was just past 3 in the morning when Lena finished checking on her last patient. As she made her way back down the dimly lit hallway, she noticed something odd. Down the corridor, she could hear the faint sound of footsteps, light and hurried, like a child running. She frowned. This section of the hospital was empty. She knew all the patients had been accounted for, and there were no visitors allowed at that hour. Curious, she followed the sound, her own footsteps echoing off the walls as she moved down the hall. The sound grew fainter, as if the child were running just out of reach. The corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, and every time she thought she was close, the sound would shift, retreating around the next corner. A chill ran down her spine as she continued to follow, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Finally, the footsteps stopped, and Lena found herself standing in front of room 305, a room she knew was supposed to be empty. She paused, staring at the door, feeling an overwhelming urge to turn back. But something compelled her to push forward, to turn the handle and step inside. The room was dark, lit only by the dim glow of the hallway lights streaming in from behind her. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the faint outline of a small figure standing by the window. It was a boy, no older than 7 or 8, wearing an old-fashioned hospital gown. His shoulders were hunched, his head bowed, and in his small hands he clutched something tightly. Lena's throat went dry. "Thomas?" she whispered, the name escaping her lips before she could stop herself. At the sound of her voice, the boy turned, his face illuminated by the pale light. His eyes were wide, filled with a sadness so deep it seemed to reach out and wrap around her heart. In his hands, he held a worn, stuffed bear, its fur matted and old. Lena felt her stomach twist as she looked at him, his small frame seeming so fragile, so lost. "Are you lost?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy didn't answer, but his lips trembled and tears began to well in his eyes. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed toward the door, his gaze fixed on something just beyond her. Lena turned to look, but the hallway was empty. When she looked back, the boy had disappeared, leaving the room cold and silent, the only evidence of his presence a faint childlike whisper that lingered in the air. "Help me find her." Shaken, Lena left the room, her mind racing. She went to the nurse's station and pulled out the hospital records, digging through old files until she found the one she was looking for. Thomas Harding, age 8, admitted decades ago and recorded as deceased in room 305. For the rest of her shift, she couldn't shake the image of Thomas's face, the sorrow in his eyes, the silent plea for help. That morning, as the sun began to rise, she returned to room 305 one last time. The room was empty, but on the windowsill she found something that hadn't been there before, a small, dusty teddy bear, old and worn, just like the one she'd seen Thomas holding. Days passed, but the encounter continued to haunt Lena. She couldn't stop thinking about Thomas, the boy who had died alone, waiting for a mother who never came. She began leaving small toys on the windowsill of room 305 each night, a small car, a stuffed animal, a storybook, hoping it would bring some peace to the spirit of the lost child. One night, she brought a small nightlight shaped like a star and plugged it into the wall beside the bed. She turned it on and the room filled with a soft, gentle glow, a comforting light in the darkness. For the first time since she'd started working there, the hallway outside room 305 felt warmer, less foreboding, as though the presence of the lost boy had faded. But just as Lena began to feel relief, she heard it. Soft footsteps, running down the hallway, stopping just outside room 305. She turned, her heart pounding, to see a small handprint appear on the window, slowly fading, as if Thomas was finally saying goodbye. Since then, the sightings of the lost boy have dwindled, and the staff say the eerie sounds have stopped. But Lena knows that every once in a while, late at night, a toy will vanish from the windowsill, and a faint, childlike whisper will fill the empty room, a gentle "thank you." And whenever Lena passes room 305, she can't help but smile, knowing that Thomas has finally found peace. Years ago, Cedar Ridge Hospital was known for its bustling psychiatric wing. It had treated countless patients with some of the most complex mental health issues in the state, and it had built up a reputation for providing excellent care. But there was one room that was always kept locked, hidden away in a back corridor that even the most experienced nurses avoided at night. Room 311. According to hospital legend, room 311 had once housed a patient named Margaret Shaw. Margaret had been admitted to the psychiatric wing in the late 1960s, suffering from severe psychosis. Her condition was so acute that she was placed under 24-hour observation. But Margaret had an odd habit. She insisted that she was being watched by a shadow doctor. No matter where she was in the room, she claimed to see him lurking in the corners, his face obscured, his eyes empty sockets. She'd scream for hours on end, begging the nurses to get him out, and begging this invisible figure to leave her alone. No one saw anything, of course, and they assumed it was all in her mind. But one night, her cries stopped. When the nurse on duty checked on her, Margaret was slumped against the wall, her hands clenched into fists, her eyes wide open and fixed in horror. She was dead. And the strangest part? There was no physical cause of death. Her heart had simply stopped. Rumor had it that she died of fright, her heart giving out in the face of something she couldn't escape. After that, the room was sealed off, only occasionally reopened for storage. But everyone knew it had a history, and staff avoided it whenever possible. Years passed, and the psychiatric wing was eventually shut down. The hospital converted the old rooms into storage and offices, but room 3111 remained locked, gathering dust and forgotten by most, until one winter night, when a severe snowstorm left the hospital short-staffed. The power flickered in and out, and the backup generators strained to keep the essential systems running. As a last resort, the head nurse, Maria, was forced to open room 311 to use as an overflow space for patients stranded by the storm. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses, and she was too exhausted to care about the old story. She unlocked the door and went inside, flipping on the lights. The air was thick, stale, and cold. The bed was still in its original place, and dust coated every surface. As she cleaned and prepped the room, Maria felt a strange sensation, like she was being watched. She brushed it off, attributing it to nerves and exhaustion. But as she finished setting up the room, she felt a chill settle around her, almost as though someone were standing just behind her. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. Later that night, a patient was brought in, an elderly woman suffering from pneumonia who needed somewhere to rest until she could be discharged in the morning. Maria reluctantly placed her in room 311 and checked on her frequently. Each time she entered, she noticed the woman seemed uneasy, her gaze constantly shifting to the corners of the room, her breathing shallow and strained. Around midnight, the woman pressed her call button. When Maria arrived, the woman's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She gripped Maria's arm and whispered, "Please tell him to go away. I see him in the corner, watching. He's so close." Her voice was shaking, her eyes fixed on an empty corner of the room. Maria felt a prickle of fear creep up her spine. She didn't see anything, but the woman's terror was real, almost infectious. Trying to comfort her, Maria assured her there was no one else in the room, gently holding her hand until she calmed down. The woman's breathing steadied, but her gaze never left the corner, her eyes filled with the kind of terror that no comforting words could soothe. A few hours later, Maria checked on the woman again. But when she entered the room, her blood ran cold. The woman was lying still, her eyes open and locked on the corner, her face twisted in a final expression of horror, her hand gripping the sheet so tightly her knuckles were white. She was gone, just like Margaret Shaw all those years ago, with no explanation for her sudden death. Maria closed the door to room 311, unable to shake the feeling of dread that clung to her. But her shift wasn't over, and she still had work to do. As she moved down the hallway, she heard faint footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, matching her pace. She turned, but the hallway was empty. She quickened her steps, but the footsteps did too, growing louder, closer, as though someone were walking just behind her, matching her every move. Heart pounding, Maria ducked into the break room, closing the door and pressing her back against it, trying to catch her breath. The footsteps stopped, but then she heard something else. A faint, raspy breathing on the other side of the door, as if someone were standing just inches away. Her hand shook as she reached for the door handle, and slowly she opened it, peering into the hallway. Nothing. The corridor was silent, empty, yet the chill remained, lingering in the air like a warning. Maria refused to enter room 311 again. She filed a report, and the hospital administration quietly sealed the door, marking the room out of service. But strange things continued to happen. Staff members reported hearing whispers near the door at night, and sometimes, just as they passed room 311, they would catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure standing just beyond the frosted glass, its hollow eyes watching, waiting. Over time, Cedar Ridge Hospital became infamous for its haunted room. But the staff knew that whatever haunted room 311 wasn't bound to its walls. Even now, the shadow doctor waits, lurking in the dark corners of the hospital, watching and following anyone who dares to open the door to room 311. And those who hear his footsteps behind them late at night know better than to look back. Because if you do, they say you'll find him standing there, his empty eyes meeting yours, his cold, shadowy presence seeping into your soul. And once he's found you, he never lets you go. In the basement of Harlow General Hospital, a long-forgotten morgue lay abandoned. The room had been closed for decades, replaced by a newer facility on the opposite side of the hospital, but the old morgue was never cleared out. Old, rusted metal tables, empty gurneys, and ancient filing cabinets sat undisturbed, coated in a thick layer of dust. Few staff ever ventured down. Most weren't even aware it existed, but those who did knew better than to go there alone. The rumor was that a doctor named Samuel Winters once performed questionable experiments in that basement, working well past the bounds of medical ethics. His obsession with death was widely known among staff, and it was said that he would sometimes work on bodies long after they'd been pronounced dead. No one knew exactly what he did, but whispers hinted at attempts to bring the dead back to life, using procedures that no sane physician would dare to try. Dr. Winters disappeared one night without a trace, leaving his work unfinished. From that night onward, strange things began happening around the hospital, and the basement morgue was promptly sealed off. Years later, Nurse Emily found herself working late one night, running samples to the basement lab after hours. She'd been at the hospital only a few weeks and had heard little about the place's history. On her way back from the lab, she noticed an old elevator she hadn't seen before, its door slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of her, and she pushed the button to take it down, figuring it would be faster than retracing her steps. When the elevator doors opened, she found herself in a dimly lit hallway that seemed much older than the rest of the hospital. The tiles were cracked, and a thick, musty smell filled the air. She hadn't realized the basement extended this far. She turned to leave, but the elevator doors closed before she could get back inside. The hallway was silent as she walked down it, the shadows stretching long and eerie across the walls. She saw a single door marked morgue at the end of the corridor. Her heart thumped hard in her chest, but she found herself drawn to it, compelled by a strange, unexplainable feeling. She pushed the door open, and the stale smell of death wafted out, stronger than before. Inside, the room was even darker, with only the faint light of her phone casting eerie shadows on the walls. The morgue looked like it had been left exactly as it was, decades ago, with old surgical instruments and yellowing charts scattered about. A strange, heavy feeling settled over her, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, just as she turned to leave, she heard it. A faint rustling sound, coming from the far side of the room. Her stomach tightened as she turned her flashlight in the direction of the sound. At first, she saw nothing, but then she noticed something. A figure lying on one of the rusted tables, covered by an old, stained sheet. The outline of the body underneath was unmistakable. Emily's heart pounded as she backed toward the door, but before she could reach it, the sheet shifted. Slowly, it began to slide down, revealing a withered, pale face staring up at her, eyes open and glassy. It was then she noticed something else, a name tag, yellowed and faded, pinned to the figure's collar. Dr. Samuel Winters. The figure's head turned slightly, its eyes locking onto hers. "Why did you come here?" The voice was little more than a rasp, like leaves scraping across pavement, but it was undeniably real. Emily froze, unable to move, as Dr. Winters continued, his voice growing stronger. I was so close to understanding death." The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the morgue seemed to transform around her. Shadows danced on the walls, and she could see the faint outlines of bodies lying on every table, as if the room were once again full of the dead, all watching her with hollow eyes. She felt their gaze, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on her. In a flash, the lights stabilized, and the room returned to its previous state. The tables were empty, the shadows still. But Dr. Winters' body remained, his eyes following her every move. Emily stumbled back, her hand fumbling for the door handle. She yanked it open and ran into the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly as she fled. She found her way back to the main part of the hospital, breathless and shaken. But when she turned back, the old hallway was gone. The door to the morgue had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. Her co-workers dismissed her story as exhaustion or hallucination, but Emily knew what she'd seen, and she never ventured to the basement alone again. Since then, staff members have reported the same strange experiences. Occasionally, the old elevator will show up, as if inviting someone to take a ride down to the forgotten morgue. Those who are unlucky enough to answer that call say they hear whispers in the dark, faint footsteps echoing in empty halls, and the unmistakable feeling of eyes watching them from every shadow. And if they look closely enough, they might see a figure in a white coat standing in the corner, waiting, his hollow gaze piercing through the darkness, searching for someone who might finally understand the secrets he took to his grave. Grayson Memorial Hospital had a history it tried hard to forget. Buried in the records was a nightmarish case from the early 1980s. A patient named John Acker, a man with a mysterious and untreatable illness that drove him to madness. John had come to the hospital one stormy evening, claiming he was being followed by something he called the Veil. He would rant to anyone who would listen, saying it was a shadow that hung around him, waiting for his last breath so it could claim him. Nurses said he barely slept, constantly looking over his shoulder, his hands shaking, his eyes bloodshot from terror. Despite extensive tests, no one could explain his condition. John's health declined rapidly, and one night he started screaming that the veil was closing in. Staff rushed to restrain him, but he was impossibly strong in his frenzy. He broke free, running through the halls, banging on doors, and pleading for someone to help him escape from his unseen pursuer. By the time they sedated him, John was already fading. His last words were a gasping whisper, "It's here." When the nurses came to check his body the next morning, they found his bed empty, the sheets twisted and stained with something dark and viscous, like ink. A strange, shadowy residue was smeared along the walls, and no one could explain where he had gone. The hospital conducted an investigation, but after a few weeks, John Acker's case was quietly closed and he was marked as disappeared. The room he was last seen in, room 417, was closed off. But soon after, strange things started happening around the hospital. Patients reported seeing dark shapes flickering at the edges of their vision. Some described feeling a cold, heavy presence at night, a shadow lurking in the corners that seemed to watch them as they slept. Years passed, and room 417 was eventually reopened as the hospital expanded. Nurses tried not to think about John Acker and the legends that lingered about his disappearance. But one nurse, Sarah, learned the story when she was assigned to room 417 for her night shift. She laughed it off, calling it a creepy bedtime story to scare new staff. But that night, Sarah would come to know the truth of what lingered in room 417. It was just past midnight when Sarah's shift began. As she made her rounds, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong in that room. The air felt thick, almost stifling, and no matter how much she adjusted the thermostat, a deep chill lingered. The patient inside, a middle-aged man recovering from surgery, seemed restless. His face pale, eyes darting around as if he sensed something lurking in the shadows. Sarah checked on him periodically, but each time he seemed more agitated. Around 2 a.m., she found him sitting upright, staring at the far corner of the room, his face ashen with terror. Do you see it?" he whispered, his voice quivering. "The shadow, it's watching me." Sarah's skin prickled, but she tried to reassure him. "There's nothing there. You're just a bit disoriented from the medication." The patient shook his head, his eyes wide and desperate. "No, it's real. I've seen it for hours. I think it's waiting for me." His hand reached out, gripping her arm with a desperate strength. "Please, don't leave me alone." Sarah stayed with him, trying to calm him, though she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rising. She glanced at the corner he was staring at, but it was empty, or so she thought. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a flicker, a dark shape that seemed to bleed into the shadows. She blinked, and it was gone, but the sensation of being watched remained. Around 3 a.m., the man's heart monitor began to beep erratically, and he clutched his chest, gasping, his face twisted in terror as he stared at the corner. "It's here," he managed to choke out. Sarah tried to call for help, but the lights in room 417 began to flicker, plunging them in and out of darkness. In the brief moments of light, she saw it, a black, shifting mass, pulsing in the corner like something alive, something sentient. The shadow seemed to grow, stretching across the walls, inching closer with each flicker of the lights. The man's breaths turned into desperate gasps as he pointed at the shadow, his mouth moving in silent horror. And then, with a final blood-curdling scream, his heart flatlined. As the lights steadied, the shadow melted back into the corner, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Sarah was left standing in silence, staring at the empty corner, the eerie quiet settling like a weight in the room. The rest of the night was a blur. When the day shift arrived, she reported the patient's death, but she left out the shadow, the chilling sense of something sentient lurking just beyond the light. She knew they would never believe her. Sarah tried to put the night behind her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. She'd see shadows move out of the corner of her eye and feel cold drafts in warm rooms, hear faint whispers in empty hallways. And then one night, as she was closing up for the evening, she noticed a dark stain on her uniform, a strange ink-like smudge on her sleeve, eerily reminiscent of the shadow she'd seen. Over time, she heard of other nurses experiencing similar things. Strange stains appearing on clothes and sheets, patients reporting seeing shadows in their rooms, a cold presence lurking just behind them. Rumor had it that once you saw the veil, it stayed with you, watching, waiting, following you in the shadows, an endless presence that would claim you when you least expected it. Years later, Sarah left her job, unable to handle the haunting memories that followed her. But even after she left Grayson Memorial, she still felt the veil close behind her, always there, a dark presence hovering just out of sight, waiting for the moment she was alone, waiting to claim her the way it had claimed John Acker, and countless others since. Whispering Pines Asylum had been abandoned for over 60 years, but locals still whispered about the horrors that once took place within its walls. Built in the 1920s, the asylum had seen its share of misery, especially in the final years, when questionable experiments and unorthodox treatments were rumored to have taken place. The most chilling story, though, was about a particular ward known as the Silent Hall. The Silent Hall was a narrow, windowless corridor at the back of the asylum. Patients who were considered too far gone, or hopeless, were kept there in isolation, away from other patients and the prying eyes of visitors. It was said that the lead doctor, Dr. Malcolm Gray, would perform experimental treatments there, treatments that no one else witnessed and that he never recorded. For decades, people had reported hearing cries, and whispers emanating from the abandoned building at night, especially near the old Silent Hall. But no one dared venture inside, except for a group of 3 urban explorers who were determined to document the asylum and capture any paranormal activity. Among them was Lucas, a seasoned investigator with a fascination for the paranormal, his friend Emily, who operated the camera, and Jay, a skeptic who thought the whole thing was ridiculous, but tagged along for the thrill. They entered the asylum one cold October evening, with flashlights in hand and cameras rolling. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and every step echoed through the vast, empty halls. The deeper they went, the colder it got, and an eerie silence settled over them, broken only by the occasional groan of the building as it settled into the night. After exploring for a while, they reached a rusted metal door with a faded sign barely legible in the dim light. Silent Hall. Lucas's face lit up with excitement, but Emily hesitated. She felt a strange pressure in her chest, a feeling that grew stronger the closer they got to the door. Jay rolled his eyes and pushed it open, muttering that they'd come this far and he wasn't about to stop now. The hall was narrow, just as the stories said, with doors lining each side. Rusted metal chairs sat in each room, some with faded leather straps on the armrests. In one room, the walls were scratched raw, and deep grooves marked the floor as though something or someone had tried to claw its way out. As they moved deeper into the hall, an unsettling feeling washed over them, like they were being watched. But no one else was there. Emily began to feel a heaviness in her chest. She whispered to Lucas that maybe they should leave, but he waved her off, too engrossed in the history of the place to listen. Then, as they reached the last door at the end of the hall, they heard it, a faint whisper. "Help me!" They froze. The whisper was so soft it could have been the wind, but it sounded close, far too close. Lucas leaned in, listening closely, while Jay laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. But then the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me!" Emily tightened her grip on the camera, her hands trembling. She aimed it down the corridor, and through the lens, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway of one of the rooms they had just passed, its form barely visible in the dim light. She gasped, but when she looked up from the camera, there was nothing there. Jay noticed her reaction and scoffed. "Come on, it's just your mind playing tricks." But Lucas seemed captivated. He pulled out his EVP recorder and asked, "Is anyone here with us?" There was a long pause, and then a faint, raspy voice filled the recorder's speaker. "They left us here in the dark." Jay's face went pale, and for the first time, he looked genuinely frightened. Lucas's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and excitement. He asked another question, his voice barely a whisper. "Who left you here?" Another long silence, and then the voice replied, even fainter this time. "Dr. Gray." The temperature seemed to drop further, and a cold, prickling sensation ran up their spines. Emily felt a sudden urge to leave, but Lucas was pressing on, determined to uncover the truth. He moved closer to the last door where the whisper seemed loudest and reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room with a single chair in the center. Heavy leather straps hung limply from the armrests, and a layer of dust covered everything except for a faint outline on the floor, as though something or someone had been recently sitting there. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping all three in the tiny room. Panic surged through them as they frantically tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Then, without warning, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with tortured voices pleading for help. Voices calling out for escape. Voices cursing Dr. Gray. Emily screamed, her back pressed against the cold metal door as the room grew darker, the shadows twisting and closing in around them. Through the darkness, they saw figures, faint, transparent figures with hollow eyes and faces twisted in agony. They reached out, their hands ghostly and thin, as if trying to drag the living down into their eternal torment. Jay was screaming now, clawing at the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't open. Lucas stood frozen, his face pale as he watched the shadowy figures close in. Then, through the cacophony of voices, they heard one voice rise above the others, a voice colder and sharper than the rest. "You're not leaving. Not now." Emily felt a hand, a cold, skeletal hand, brush her arm, sending a wave of ice through her veins. She screamed, and just then the door flew open, as if released by some unseen force. They stumbled out of the room, gasping for air, and bolted down the silent hall, the whispers echoing behind them, growing fainter as they neared the exit. They didn't stop running until they were outside, the asylum looming dark and silent behind them. Gasping and shaking, they looked back, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching them from the windows. But the building stood still, as silent as the grave. The three of them swore never to return to Whispering Pines. But from that night onward, they each carried a piece of it with them. Lucas started hearing whispers in his apartment, faint voices that grew louder each night, always calling for help. Jay began seeing shadowy figures out of the corner of his eye, figures that vanished whenever he turned to look, but left him feeling watched, never alone. And Emily, every time she looked in a mirror, would catch a glimpse of something standing behind her, dark, hollow-eyed, waiting. They tried to move on, but they knew deep down that the silent hall wasn't done with them. For once you entered its shadowed corridors, its darkness never truly let you go. On the outskirts of Willow Creek stood the old Belridge Children's Hospital, a crumbling relic that hadn't seen a patient in over 50 years. It had been closed down after a series of tragic accidents, each more disturbing than the last. Staff members were rumored to have heard children's laughter in empty hallways, or felt small, cold hands grab their legs when no one was around. Eventually, patients stopped coming, and the hospital was abandoned, left to decay with the stories of those who had died there. For decades, locals warned each other to stay away from Belridge, saying the hospital was cursed, haunted by the children who had died there. But that didn't stop Jacob, a thrill-seeking paranormal investigator who had made a name for himself exploring infamous haunted sites. He'd heard all the stories about Belridge, the children who had died, the mysterious disappearances, and the playroom, where people claimed to hear the sound of bouncing balls in the dead of night. It was exactly the kind of story he was looking for. Jacob arrived one stormy night, his camera ready, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows against the cracked walls as he made his way through the hospital's entryway. Peeling wallpaper clung to the walls, and mold crept across the ceiling in sickly green patches. The air was thick, stale, and carried the faint smell of antiseptic, as if the echoes of long-forgotten treatments still lingered. He made his way through the hallways, recording everything, narrating in a low voice to his unseen viewers. "This is the hallway where nurses reported hearing footsteps at night, even after the last child was gone," he said, his voice bouncing off the empty walls. He kept moving, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he reached the heart of the hospital, the pediatric wing. It was colder here, the air thick and unmoving. He passed room after room, each one with small, rusted beds and dusty toys strewn about, as if the children had simply vanished. Then he found it, the playroom. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a large, empty space filled with scattered toys. Dolls with missing eyes, balls covered in dust, toy trucks rusted from years of neglect. The atmosphere in the room was different, heavy and oppressive, as if the very walls remembered the laughter, the cries, and the last moments of the children who had once played there. Jacob raised his camera, whispering, "This is where the nurses heard the children's voices after dark." As he panned his flashlight across the room, he froze. In the far corner, a small rubber ball sat perfectly still in the center of the floor. Dust settled around it in a perfect circle, as though it hadn't been touched in years. But then, without warning, the ball began to roll slowly toward him, picking up speed as it crossed the floor, bouncing slightly as it moved. Jacob swallowed hard, adrenaline spiking as he took a step back, the ball stopping just inches from his foot. He was about to bend down and pick it up when he heard it, a faint giggle echoing from the corner of the room. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the corner was empty. A chill crawled up his spine as the giggle echoed again, this time closer. He stepped back, his hand shaking as he aimed the camera at the ball. But just as he turned to leave, he heard a faint voice, a child's voice, almost a whisper. "Play with us." His flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment he saw them, two small children standing by the doorway, their faces pale and their eyes hollow, watching him with an intensity that seemed to reach into his soul. He blinked, and they were gone, but the whisper remained, echoing in the silence. He could still hear it, faint and insistent, like an invitation he couldn't refuse. Jacob stumbled out of the playroom, his heart pounding as he navigated the darkened halls, desperate to get out. But as he passed each room, he began to notice strange shadows moving just beyond his flashlight's beam. Quick glimpses of tiny figures darting in and out of doorways, always just out of reach, always watching. The laughter started soon after, soft at first like a distant memory, but growing louder with every step. He turned a corner, and there they were, small figures standing in the hallway, their backs to him, their heads tilted slightly as if listening. He could make out the outline of 5 or 6 children, all silent, unmoving. He took a step back, but then one of the figures turned to face him. It was a young boy, his face blank and expressionless, with dark, sunken eyes. He raised a hand and pointed at Jacob, his mouth stretching into a wide, unnatural grin. "Stay and play." The others turned, their empty eyes locking onto him, their faces slowly contorting into smiles. The laughter grew louder, filling the hallway until it felt like it was coming from inside his own head, a twisted symphony of joy and malice. The children began to move toward him, their small footsteps echoing as they advanced, reaching out with pale skeletal hands. Panicked, Jacob turned and ran, the laughter following him, filling the halls, bouncing off the walls as he sprinted through the hospital. Doors slammed shut as he passed, as if the building itself were alive, trapping him inside its endless maze. He could still hear the voices, each one a faint whisper in the darkness. "Play with us. Forever." He reached the front door, threw it open, and stumbled outside, gasping for air as he looked back. The hospital stood silent, the laughter fading as if it had never been there. But as he turned to leave, he saw something chilling in the reflection of his camera's viewfinder, a small handprint pressed into the dust on his shoulder. He brushed at it, but it wouldn't go away. Over the next few days, Jacob began to notice other strange things. A child's laugh echoing in his apartment, toys moving on their own, small footprints appearing in the dust around his home. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks, but deep down he knew. Belridge Children's Hospital hadn't let him go. The children had followed him home, their whispers growing louder each night, their laughter echoing in his dreams. And one night, as he sat in his darkened living room, he felt it, a small, cold hand resting on his shoulder, squeezing just hard enough to remind him that he was never truly alone. The next morning, his neighbors found his apartment empty, with nothing but a layer of dust on the floor and a small rubber ball lying in the center of the room. And though they searched everywhere, there was no sign of Jacob, only the faint, eerie sound of children's laughter drifting through the empty halls of Belridge, as if welcoming him back into their eternal game.